Thank you all for joining us today for this conversation about the movements for Asian American Studies at UC San Diego. My name is Wendy Sasaki. I use she and they series pronouns. I serve as the inaugural Asian Pacific Islander Middle Eastern Thesis American Program Manager at UC San Diego. And on behalf of my office, APAMEDA Programs and Services, APSA, and the API Studies program, we are really excited to be able to have this conversation and host this conversation with our guest today. So as we start, I'd like to share a land acknowledgement. The UC San Diego community holds great respect for the land and the original people of the area where our campus is located. Our campus is located on, and I am speaking with you today from the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. Today, the Kumeyaay people continue to maintain their political sovereignty and cultural traditions, as vital members of the San Diego community. UC San Diego acknowledges their tremendous contributions to our region and thank them for their stewardship. If you'd like to learn more about what a land acknowledgement is and perhaps consider the land that you are on and the Native and Indigenous people who are from that land, I encourage you to go to this link or use the internet to find additional information about the Indigenous people on the land with which you are on today. To learn more about our office, APAMEDA Programs and Services, you can find us on all of the different kinds of internet things that I'm sure my staff will share in the chat as well. So please feel free to visit our sites. This video will be posted on our YouTube channel as well. And if you're interested in signing up for our electronic newsletter, you can do so on our website. I encourage you also to learn more about our Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies program at UC San Diego. This was, as we'll discuss a little bit later, approved last year in this format. And so you can find the information on their website and email for more additional information. We will also be talking about a little bit about the Asian American Pacific Islander Studies Community Archive Project. We will share the link as well at different points later. But if this is something that you are interested in, particularly current students who might like to be involved with participating in the archive of the history, you can fill out this form to indicate your interest and get more information. We'll share more about the archive project. So as we start, I'd like to welcome our guests. We're very excited that this is something that we were able to host. This is an idea that my staff and I had also had last year before the pandemic. And so we're glad that we have now an actual program, because at the time we were talking about it last year, the minor had not been approved for students to declare yet. And now that it is, and there has been some other work that's been done, we are even more excited that we will have a richer conversation with our guests. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see what I'm supposed to read, because that should happen. So we are excited to host this conversation between Professor Jim Lin and Professor Simeon Man. In June 2020, we were excited to learn that the Academic Senate approved the proposed Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies minor after a more recent set of student activism and advocacy based on the Coalition for Critical Asian American Studies and their open letter, which was published in February of 2014. While students were able to, for the first time at UC San Diego, declare a minor in Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies this past fall, the minor had once been approved in the 1980s, soon after Professor Lin taught the first Asian American Studies course as a special course listed through Muir College. APAMEDA Programs and Services is excited to be able to host this conversation between two people who are instrumental in the existence of AAPI studies at UC San Diego today. Professor Jim Lin is a retired professor in mathematics. He has served as an acting provost for Muir College and Sixth College and the advisor for the Asian and Pacific Islander Student Alliance. And Professor Simeon Man is an associate professor of history, the associate director of the Institute of Arts and Humanities, and the director of the Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies program. He's also working with the library, Apameda Programs and Services, and an awesome group of students on the Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies Community Archive Project, which is identifying in archives to document the history of the movements for Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies at UC San Diego. So thank you both for joining us today. I'm really excited that we're able to have this conversation and record this so that folks can also learn more about these movements that have happened on campus. So to start, I'd like to ask Jim, can you share with us what the campus was like and the student activism that prompted the first Asian American Studies course to happen?
Yeah, just to give you some background of what it was like in the 1980s, both in San Diego and at UCSD, and kind of my personal story. So San Diego was, back then a military town. It had a submarine base. It had a Miramar Air Force Base, which is still around, and to the north is Camp Pendleton Marine Training Base. And actually, many of you undergrads may not know, but UCSD was built on an Army training base called Camp Matthews. So the military was pretty dominant at the time. And then also, not that long ago, the Vietnam War had occurred, and General William Westmoreland said that, Asians place no value on human life. I mean, he made that public statement, not thinking that Asians live in the US as well. So even though Asians had lived in San Diego since the 1860s, they were considered foreigners or newcomers. And so plenty of times I would get things like, where are you from? So forth, those kinds of questions. Where are you really from? And I was actually, when I think about, I came in 1974 at the age of 24, I got my PhD. And at the time, I think I was pretty much the first American-born Asian professor at UCSD. Maybe Mel Okamura, he's another guy in the biology department. So when you take that into account, and then I looked at the census just to see, how many American-born Asians got their PhD in math, and I was among the first 10 at the time. So I was really a singularity. I mean, the whole campus was full of a lot of Asian professors, but most of them had gotten their undergraduate degree, somewhere in Asia. And so when they came here, they got their PhD and then became professors at UCSD. And so I would constantly, and they would invite me to parties, and, try and set me up with some of their women that they had as, possible dates for me and stuff. But culturally, I just wasn't like that. I grew up eating hamburgers and pizza and loving American music like Carole King and James Taylor and the Beatles. And culturally, you probably know that if in high school you went to some place in Asia, all of your cultural values were formed by then, and I was different. So what happened, I kind of looked around for, who I can hang out with, and it turned out to be the Asian Pacific Student Alliance. They weren't much younger than me, and they had my values and they appreciated things. And plus, because I was a faculty, they'd put my name on as faculty advisors, so they'd get money for their parties and their graduation and all that stuff. And so it was a good fit. And so that back then that happened. And then what about UCSD? Well, UCSD in the 80s, UCSD started in the mid 60s. The undergraduate population just began in maybe 65. And Asian American Studies, the field, began in the mid 60s. So Asian American Studies and UCSD are about the same age. And so, and I don't know if you know, at UCSD in the 70s, a lot of students demonstrated against the Vietnam War. And actually, there was a student, a grad student, who felt so strongly that he wanted the war to end that he, around Ravel Plaza, he lit himself up with gasoline and he killed himself. So there was a lot of tension back then. And then Angela Davis was there at the time. And I was actually good friends with Herbert Marcuse's wife, Ricky Sheriver Marcuse. So I knew something about that, but I really, mainly I was just looking for a cultural group to hang out with. And the Asian Pacific Student Alliance was the best I could find at the time. So given all that, you know, the other thing is to look at is, oh, and I call out a very important person here at this meeting, and that's Yen Espiritu, because, you know, later on the Ethnic Studies Department was created in 1990, and Yen was the first hire. So UCSD is very fortunate to have over 30 years of someone teaching Asian American studies at its university, and very few other places have that kind of richness of education. So where was I? I'm kind of losing my track of thought, but Yen had a student, a PhD student named Angela Kong, and Angela Kong would interview me about what I did with Asian American Studies. And Angela Kong's PhD thesis, which you can find on, you can just Google it, and the entire thesis is there, is really the most recorded history of the Asian American movement at UCSD. So, so that's kind of some of the things, a little bit of background. Okay, back in the 80s, you have to remember that there wasn't anything like email or World Wide Web or internet or cell phones, certainly. And there wasn't anything like, I think a lot of things were hand typed. I don't know when word processing happened, but one of the reasons why we're holding this meeting today is because Daphne Dwan, who's she's here at this meeting, 6 months ago, uncovered this file of all correspondence with the Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs. And this person, Harold Tico, controls all the purse strings for all faculty hires at UCSD. So she uncovered this archive of over 300 letters that I had totally forgot about, you know. So, you know, between that archive, all these letters, at least over 100 letters demanding that Asian American Studies be created. And another person who's in this crowd is Mitz Tamita. He was there, I think, at my class. And also Annie Flager, I think, was in my class. Anyway, it's pretty amazing that, you know, when I look at those 300 pages, all of a sudden, you know, like, how many people remember what you did 35 years ago? I mean, I certainly, you know, had sort of little memory here, little memory there. I couldn't put it together. But that was together with Angela Kong's thesis and this file from Harold Tico's letters and my own files, that's kind of how I'm coming up with this story I'm going to talk about today. Okay, so I think you get some idea of what it was like back then. This is, you know, quite different. Oh, the other thing, you know, most of you students you're used to, UCSD has over 40,000 students now. Back then it had about 14,000 students. And back then it only had 2,000 Asian students. And now it probably has over 16,000 Asian students. So the whole environment was quite different back then versus now. it's just, so you just have to kind of picture, we're talking about 35 years ago, a long time ago. So.
Can you share a bit about how you as a math professor were able to teach the first Asian American Studies course at UC San Diego, and how you prepared and developed the syllabus for this kind of course?
Yeah, I mean, the story is kind of beyond fiction. I mean, it's just sort of unbelievable. But what happened was, the year before I taught the course, Ling-Chi Wang visited the history department, and actually he taught a really small seminar in the seminar room. I think it's across from Simeon's office. Anyway, it's about 10 students, and he was teaching about Asians post-World War II that had come to the US. So Ling-Chi is probably the world's authority on, post-World War II Asians in the US. And that happened to fit with me. My family immigrated in 1949. And so, it's only 10 students in the class, and I sat there and he wondered, who the heck is this guy? He doesn't look like a student. And so he invited me over for dinner. And I explained I'm a math professor, in the department. And we ended up, his wife gave this incredible meal, and I'm just laughing and having a great time, drinking lots of wine and stuff. And Linda said, "Oh, okay, I'm gonna go to bed night." And I says, "Okay, all right, thanks for having me over." And then Ling-Chi and I end up talking, and before you know it, I look out the window and it's morning time. We ended up talking all night, and I never do that. I'm really pretty polite. And oh, it's getting late. It's time for me to leave. But what happened that was so valuable to me is he explained that my family came to the US not with the normal wave of immigrants from, like most of the Asians who came to the US, either they came with the gold rush and the building of the railroad, or, doing the agriculture, or things like that. And they came, and there are many generations in the US. Or you had these other ones that came after 1965 with the immigration laws changed. And, here I'd grown up in an all-white elementary school, middle school, and high school. And basically I had tried to become white because there wasn't any other culture that, I could aspire to. It's just really, I'd come home and my parents would be speaking Chinese, and I kind of rejected that. And so I just was really Americanized. But on the other hand, this guy was telling me some facts my father didn't know about immigration patterns. And I could, why did we live in an all-white neighborhood? Why did we, do the things we did? I had no explanation, So here this guy was telling me all these facts about, you fit into this sort of, there's only a couple hundred families that came when you came. And so for you to be American born Asian is pretty rare, because either, you came from one of these other immigration patterns. So that kind of, I began to put together, why did I grow up the way I did? Why am I the way I am? Why have I rejected a lot of things? But on top of that, this guy proceeded to say, well, there's this whole field called Asian American Studies, and they study immigration patterns, and they study, what is the mass movement? What are most Asian Americans? How are they living? How are the relations with Asia affecting Asians living in the US? What about Asian American culture? What about Asian American literature? That's all. Asian American Studies is a multidisciplinary field that studies all those things. And I had never heard of it, And so that was a shock. Now, the other guy who I met too, this other guy, Tommy Woon, was a Asian American counselor coordinator at Oberlin College. Ling-Chi was a lot older than me, but Tommy was my age. He was American born. and he was involved in academia. And there weren't that many American-born Asians in academia at the time. And so we got to talking. We both avoided the Vietnam War. We both loved sports. We both loved, hiking and camping and fishing. We complained about the lack of Asian athletes. In fact, later on, my second daughter, I would name Christy Lin after Christy Yamaguchi. I mean, that was, we just talked for hours. And back then, you couldn't talk for free. So we bought tons of cell phone cards. We just, he was in Ohio, I was in San Diego. And, what he admired is I was an academic, I was a full professor at the time. And he was a student affairs person who had trained at Davis in Asian American studies. So that was a very community-centered Asian American studies. And so anyway, we hit it off with, and to this day, he's one of my best friends. But he would mentor me, and Ling Chi would mentor me. And then, okay, so you get the picture of all this happening. Well, a year later, San Diego community has a meeting with Chancellor Atkinson. And this is the Union of Pan-Asian Communities. So it's probably the largest social service agency in San Diego that services Asians. So they do things like English as a second language, job placement, mental health, refugee assistance, things like that. And Beverly Yip was on the board of overseers for the union, for UCSD. And so she had some kind of direct line with Chancellor Atkinson. And so she said, look, we want to have a meeting with Chancellor Atkinson to talk about Asian Americans. And so in the meeting, and I wasn't there, actually, the reason I know about it, Yen, is because Angela Kong told me about it. This meeting was saying, Beverly Yip and the community said, look, there's this group of Asian people that are south of Freeway 8, that it's a growing group of people, and we have a lot of services that we do for this group. And this should be of interest to UCSD sociologists, should be interested in studying these people because, we have $1 million grant, and this is going to grow. And Atkinson, from what I was told, is kind of, he kind of rebuffed the group. He really didn't feel like, he argued that, well, why should we look at Asian American studies when there's no faculty representative here in this community meeting? And, but the Asian community kept pushing, and then eventually he relented and he says, okay, we'll hire a visiting prof for, I think, $18,000. And they came up with Lawson Inada. And so Lawson Inada agreed to come. And so I thought, okay, that's the end of that, But as it went through the line of administrative people, some administrator who I don't know to this day lowered the offer to $14,000. And Lawson felt insulted. He was the poet laureate of Oregon. He was a pretty prominent Asian American. He had been through the internment. And he says, I'm not going to come for that. So I heard about that meeting. And, for years now, I'd been talking to Tommy and talking with Ling Chi, and I got angry. And I jumped in. I said, I'll teach it for $14,000. Now you have to understand, this is, I have to tell, here I am, I've got all these duties as a mathematician. I have no training in Asian American studies. So how am I going to teach this course? Plus, the chancellor doesn't even know me. He vaguely knows that I was the advisor for APSA, Asian Pacific Student Alliance, and the community doesn't know me either. The Union of Pan-Asian Communities doesn't know me. But I think they must have figured out that, this crazy guy is going to teach it, and if nobody else comes forward, you got to arrange another meeting with the chancellor, and that was hard enough to arrange anyway. So they took a chance. Both the community and the administration took a chance on me. And then, then I ran into all kinds of obstacles. A mathematician can't teach Asian American studies. You can't just come to the university without any credentials at all and teach the course. And that's what I was doing. But I was a really good friend with the Muir College provost, John Stewart. And John Stewart, he adored me. He's going to do all kinds of favors for me. And he told me there's this special track called the Muir Contemporary Issues course where you can teach outside your field of interest, if you're an academic at UCSD. And, here, he's handing me this offer. So I said, okay. But not only will he do that, but he'll arrange a course schedule. He'll arrange final exams. His secretarial staff will type up all the syllabi and arrange the final schedule. And not only that, he'll make a poster to publicize this class. And the flyers you saw that advertised this event is the poster that was made by Muir College. And so this poster advertised my class, and imagine on every kiosk at UCSD, this poster was hung. So this was announcing a course in contemporary issues in Asian American studies. And then I would really work with Tommy, like, how am I going to teach this class if I don't have any credentials? I have no training. If I taught it, I'd just probably use some textbook and we'd go through chapter after chapter. I didn't have the ability to be very creative. But we decided that the best idea was to bring in guest speakers. Every week we would bring in a guest speaker. And so if you look on the poster, there's a list of all the guest speakers. And these speakers were experts in their field. And, at the time, any Asian American studies speaker that came to UCSD was never, people would flock. Any student with Asian background would go to that meeting. I mean, now look how many events are going on at UCSD. One of those events would have brought the entire Asian community. So we had 12 events. I had 12 speakers coming in. And so I would get on the phone, you can imagine, hello, my name's Jim Lin. I'm a math professor at UCSD. I'm trying to start and institutionalize a program in Asian American studies. And you're a very prominent leader in this area. If you gave a talk in my class, you could really make a difference in convincing the administration to institutionalize Asian American studies. So imagine I gave that phone call to Norman Minetta's office. So Norman Minetta was a congressman in Washington, D.C. I made that call and said, would you do it? And the guy would say, okay, I'll tell Norman Minetta about this and we'll consider it, So that was kind of the answer I'd get. But it was surprising how many people said yes. I mean, that a lot, because Asian American studies was such a new field, everybody's trying to get some publicity, and they didn't know what UCSD was. They didn't know, what's a math professor asking me to come? And I said, not only do I want you to come, but I can't pay you, because all I've got is this $14,000. I can pay for your airfare and I can pay for your lodging and meals, but the actual talk, I can't give you any honorarium. So that's kind of part of the story. And then there was this UC Regents lecture. We found this thing that you could apply to the University of California system to bring in somebody for a week. And that was Min Yasui. and it was a UC-wide competition to bring someone in. And so I applied because Tommy mentioned this guy's amazing, and actually won this Regents lectureship competition. And Min would come. My third lecture would be Min Yasui, and it would be a public lecture. So it'd be in Peterson Hall, which was, at the time, was the largest auditorium at UCSD. So most of you students know what Peterson Hall is. But anyway, he would come. And so I had this lineup of 12 speakers. And then after the speaker came, then we'd have a discussion. And then I wanted to get the community involved. So I couldn't possibly handle all the logistics, of picking people up at the airport, bringing them to their hotel, just kind of having dinner with them, all those things. So I had a potluck meeting with Priscilla Jin, who was a Chinese American judge in San Diego, who was part of the Union of Pan-Asian Communities steering committee. And so we had a potluck at her house, and all these community people came to that potluck, and I say, "Hi, my name's Jim Lin. You don't know me. I'm a math professor, but I'm trying to start an Asian American Studies program at UCSD. And I'm going to bring in 10 speakers from all around the country. And it's going to be from 4 to 5:30 on Tuesday and Thursday. So you can come, you could probably get off work and come. And but I need you to pick them up at the airport. I need you to go out to dinner with them. I need you to host them and so forth." And so I had this whole sign-up sheet Priscilla organized, and the sign-up sheet had all kinds of people who really wanted Asian American Studies at UCSD. And so they would pick up many of the speakers, and so that was kind of the three-ring circus going on. It's just, but I felt so strongly about it that Tommy and I had this vision that we think the Asian student population is going to grow. We think that the different areas that Asian American students can become is going to really be amazing. We thought that Asian athletes would amount to something. We thought that the literature and film would, this is back when there were hardly any films about Asian Americans. And so students at UCSD really thought, okay, I'm coming to UCSD because it's a science campus, and I'm going to get my degree in some kind of science field, and that'll be my trip to a successful career. And parents sent their kids there because of that. They were very much, the model minority myth really limited the possible careers Asians could get into. And even, at my family reunion, one of my aunts would talk to my daughters and say, "Doctor, lawyer, engineer, that's what you should do. If you're interested in art, forget it. That should be a hobby, or if you." And now my daughters, one of them is doing social media. She's the head of social media at Pixar. And my other daughter is an aspiring artist. So actually, it was this, I felt this vision. I felt this, and passion. And I felt like this was really missing at UCSD. So I don't know, I've rambled on, probably said too much information, but I just nod your head if you got a picture of what we were doing, is that kind of what?
Yeah.
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 Okay.
So I know you had also shared with me at a different time what the response was from the community that you invited in to come to this class. And so can you share a little bit, I guess, kind of briefly about what the response was there to kind of being able to be exposed to this at UCSD?
Yeah, I mean, let me ask this question. How many of you have taught at UCSD And in your class, 10 to 15 community members come and pay for parking and attend your class every Tuesday and Thursday. Like Mitz was one of those people, you know, and it was pretty amazing. And not only that, but the staff got organized at the time. The staff at UCSD were unorganized, but when they came to my class, they kind of found each other. And one of the staff was a videographer. And so she had that huge, you know, back then you had that video camera that was only hold a whole video cassette. And she would bring it into the class and videotape the lectures. And then some of those lectures were shown on UCSD TV. And then the community members were just, they're having a grand time. I mean, they took Lawson Inada out to dinner, and at the dinner there was some impromptu jazz concert. I wasn't there, but you know, some Asian American was a jazz pianist, and he just got up and played, and you know, so they wrote tons of letters. So in that archive, you're going to see probably 100 letters from the community, and Beverly Yip. You know, every year there's something called a UPAC banquet. And so Beverly Yip invited Chancellor Atkinson as the guest of honor. And I got to go to, I was another guest of honor. And we, you know, got a plaque saying, endorsing the creation of Asian American Studies. And also, you know, this what, I mean, you can imagine, you know, Willie Brown. I don't know, very many of you older people know Willie Brown. I mean, he was the Speaker of the House. And to give you some context, I think he was the main mentor to Gavin Newsom, who's the California governor now. But Willie Brown wrote a letter to Chancellor Atkinson that was in the archive. I didn't ever see it. And then Jim Bates, who was a congressman in our district, wrote a letter. And then the students got so excited that they created a petition. And you know, there's only 2,000 Asian students at the time, and 400 of them signed the petition. So that's 1 out of every 5 Asian students on campus. And then they went to Mayor O'Connor, the San Diego mayor, and demanded that she endorse the movement to create Asian American Studies. So it was much more of a hysteria than I could have ever dreamt of. You know, it was really amazing that, and now that I look back, you know, I had 12 different speakers. And so normally most people who teach a course in Asian American Studies teach Asian American history or Asian American literature, or maybe Asian American sociology or political science, things like that. But I had speakers, I mean, you know, I had Norman Mineta, who's a politician, and so they got to see what's it like to be an Asian American politician. I had Lawson Inada, who was a poet, and most of these students were stem cell oriented. I can't imagine becoming a poet, and Lawson talked about that. And then I had a children's author, Lawrence Yep, who I think he won the Newbery Medal Award for a story called Dragon Wings. And Dragon Wings was about this kid who lived in China who never saw his father, who was working in San Francisco. And so he was also a science fiction writer. So he talked about the feelings of isolation that Asian Americans felt, like, you know, that, you know, he had never met his father, and he took a trip to San Francisco to meet his father. And that's what the story was about. And then, so the students are just, you know, like, here, I can only go into one career. I'm going into biotech or something. And then suddenly they're confronted with these people who have all different kinds of careers and the possibilities of that. And then I had the chair of Asian American Studies at UCLA, Lucy Cheng, came down, and she talked about UCSD is just got the bid to create the International School of Pacific Rim Studies, which is now the GPS. I don't know the exact words for that. So this,
global policies,
yeah, thank
I think.
global.
Yeah.
And she said, well, the Global Policy School, or IRPS, is mainly a business school, but this is going to have a huge impact on Asians living in the US. In fact, they figured out that there would be more trade with Pacific Rim countries than there would be trade with countries in the Atlantic Ocean. And so UCSD put out a bid, and they won this bid among all the UCs to create this institute. And with that institute, there would be a lot of Asian Americans would, because of their language ability, because of their, they'd already been doing import-export with Asia, that they would be a key element in that we need to study. And then I had Elaine Kim, who was she wrote the very first book on Asian American literature, come down from Berkeley. And I had, let's see, I'm kind of drawing a blank here, but I had all kinds of different people. Oh, I had Tommy Woon, he talked about Asian men and how they, what's the effect of the Vietnam War and the emasculation of Asian American men and the lack of role models. There was no Asian man who played a leading role in any kind of film or TV at the time. And not only that, but there are all sorts of caricatures of Asian men to justify going to fight the Vietnamese in the war. So Asian men were basically nerds. They studied hard, but would they have any sense of masculinity? And then Elaine Kim said some things about Asian American women. She had written a couple books called Dear Diane, just like Dear Abby, sort of advising young Asian girls about how to be in society and so forth. And she showed a couple of videos too. And so the students and the community were getting this whole different view. And also, Atkinson was hearing about this because he went to the lecture from Min Yasui, and some of you saw that lecture on Monday, how this was a man who was not any man that I imagined anyway. I never met an older Asian man who, some of my African-American friends said, oh, he's like a Black preacher, So that was, kind of their, he was really, so all kinds of ways of breaking stereotypes. You could be different in many ways. You could aspire to be a politician. You could aspire to be a writer. You could aspire to be a poet. And I was going through that transformation too. I says, wow, even if this speaker series was around today, I think it'd be pretty good. I think it's really pretty interesting. And, so basically I taught the course for free because I used that 14,000 to pay for speakers, travel and meals and stuff. And that was also handled by the Muir College. So I didn't tell my math department I was doing any of this, because I kind of knew that wasn't going to work out. So I was leading kind of a schizoid existence. On the one hand, I was doing all this stuff for Asian Americans, and on the other hand, I had a full load teaching my math classes and doing my research. But it was for my own personal development as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Simeon, you currently teach some of the Asian American Studies courses, including the Asian American History class. And I think in hearing the way that Jim talked about this class and things like that, and some of the classes that you teach, how does this compare to what you teach, or how are the experiences for you as the faculty member and for the students who are in your class the same or different now?
Yeah, I think in hearing Jim talk, it it reminds me that the field of Asian American studies, the folks who taught the first classes, some of the first Asian American studies scholars, were not trained in Asian American studies, right? Um, and that's just a reality, right? Like there was no training available for you to teach that class, right? So teaching this class 35, 40 years later, like I am the beneficiary of like of that labor, right? The labor, the commitment that you all put in, um, and also the scholarship, right? The conceptual frameworks that have developed over the last 30 years of the field. So that definitely has changed, right? Um, I also think the relationship between the course that Jim was teaching in 1986 to the institution um, and the relationship that my class has to the institution is very different, right? So at the time, um, you had to put in the work of demonstrating and convincing the administration that this course deserves a spot in the curriculum, right? Like that's a very different fight than what I feel like I have to do now, right? We don't need to convince the administration. And in fact, there's a kind of enthusiastic embrace for a class like this now, right? It kind of falls into this long and growing list of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion classes that I think the university is in some ways excited to embrace, right? So now for me, I think the challenge is not so much convincing the administration that teaching Asian American history matters, but it's to insist that Asian American studies matters beyond just like checking off the box, right? Checking off like the DEI requirement. Um, yeah, and I guess one last thing I'll say too is um, still hear from students that there is a need and there is a desire to take more Asian American Pacific Islander studies courses. That I don't think has changed very much from the time that you taught the class, Jim, right? Students still want it. Despite the fact that Asian American Studies is now an established field, I think the fact that students are still demanding and wanting these classes just shows that um, like how underrepresented Asian American Studies is in the curriculum.
Thank you. I think even in kind of thinking about this as the curriculum and the ways that we're looking at this for the campus, both of you engaged with the proposing of a minor. And so I'd like to ask you to both kind of share a little bit about the processes that you engaged in with that, where there was support, what kinds of barriers existed in having those things at the different times that you did it proposed and approved. So Jim, if you could share first a little bit about what that process was like then.
Yeah, I think, most of the community and most of the students have no idea that there's all these academic senate committees. I think most people in the public think, well, you make a demonstration, you protest for the creation of some program, and then through the protest, then the administration creates a program. It turns out it's much more complicated than that. That you have all these systems of committees, and that's where Ling Chi played a major role. Is he knew academic senate politics, and he knew that there was something called the Committee on Educational Policy, and that when you propose a minor, then you have to write up a proposal and get it approved by this committee. And then once you get it approved, then and a minor consists of a student taking 6 courses in the area from a menu of a bunch of different courses they can take. And so usually a minor happens, after a bunch of faculty have ended up teaching in maybe related areas of Asian American studies, and they get together and says, oh, we have enough courses for a minor, let's propose it. But Ling Chi and I talked about this, and the success of this one course that I ended up teaching was so overwhelming that we said, let's risk it. Let's try and get the minor the next year. And I had a steering committee of 5 pretty prominent professors who backed me up. There was John Dower, who had won a Pulitzer Prize in history. There was Matthew Chen, who was the chair of linguistics, Misao Miyoshi, who had an endowed chair in literature, and I forgot, there was a sociologist who's Dick, anyway, it'll come back, Alzheimer's setting in here. But anyway, so we wrote up a proposal and we cited the success of this course. We cited, look, this petition signed, and actually 30 faculty signed the petition, and then, these hundreds of community letters, and also endorsement from Willie Brown and endorsement from Jim Bates, these congressmen. And then we cited the creation of the Pacific Rim School and how that would affect Asian Americans. And so basically the Committee on Educational Policy has 9 faculty and 1 student representative. And so you have to get on the agenda for the committee, just like in politics now, right? To get on the agenda is very political, but if you're the chair of the committee, then you control the agenda. So a year later, I became the chair of the Committee on Educational Policy, again, with no administrative skills at all. I was in the math department. You didn't have to deal with this stuff. But so I would, because I was the chair of the committee, I put Asian American Studies minor on the proposal, on the agenda, and it was discussed. And so, and these faculty are from all over the place. One was in history, one was in anthropology, one was in physics, one was in theater and dance. And, so these 9 faculty read the proposal and then they decide things. But luckily I had, another thing is the success of the class led to the provost funding a visiting professor for a quarter every year. And so for the next 3 years, so Su Chen Chan came down the following year, and I asked her to be interviewed by the Committee on Educational Policy. And so she kind of laid out much better than I could, the rationale, because, I'm a mathematician. How do you walk into a group of 9 professors who have never heard of a field called Asian American Studies, and then you write up this proposal and you want them to accept it, So, so that happened, and there was a long discussion, and they looked at different catalog copy of other campuses around the country that had Asian American Studies, and they looked at, they ask all kinds of questions that a mathematician doesn't have to think about, like, is this a viable program? Will students who graduate from this program have promising careers? Will there be is there enough student interest? Is there enough faculty to teach it? Because if some faculty leave, either they leave the university or they're on sabbatical, there may not be enough faculty to teach these 6 courses. And that's the kind of thing that Simeon has to worry about now. But anyway, and we proposed 1.5 faculty to start out. We thought, we had, we're just kind of gambling. Let's ask for 1.5 permanent faculty. And then, so this discussion went on for 2 meetings, and each meeting's a couple hours. And so most of the people really approved of it. They thought this is a good program, but the anthropology prof really said, is this really a legitimate area of study? And that's what Vice Chancellor Tico said at the same time. Is they argued that, you know, studying Asians in Asia is a very legitimate field. It has thousands of years of culture, literature, music, art, but Asian American studies was only 20 years old. You know, how could it possibly be as, you know, complex and worthy of a whole area of study that would justify a minor? And so I felt like, oh, this is the end. I'm going to be dead in the water because I can't justify it. But finally, they said, okay, let's go to the library and do a literature search on all the research in Asian American studies. And next month, the Committee on Educational Policy will re-meet and we'll look at the literature search and see if there's enough stuff going on. So I'm thinking that's the end of it. You know, we're gonna get defeated sooner or later. So I go to the library and pick up this computer printout. It's actually about 1.5 feet of that green and white line computer paper, you know, that's got the holes on the sides, you know, it's run through a printout machine back then. And I bring it back to the meeting and all these profs are looking at it for about a half hour, they're perusing it. And then after about a half hour, the anthropology prof says, wow, this is really interesting. There is actually as much sophisticated research in Asian American studies at top universities as there is in anthropology. And so that, you know, I mean, people at Harvard and Yale and all kinds of places were doing studies that I didn't know about. And that was the deal breaker. And so they, in the end, if you look at the recommendations of the Committee on Educational Policy, and that's in the archive that Daphne uncovered, it says, Asian American studies is a very exciting field of area. And we don't just recommend 1.5 faculty, we recommend you hire 3 faculty. So I just kind of, wow, you know, so that was, and then when Vice Chancellor Tico saw that, then he gave us hunting licenses, basically, you know, licenses to do a search for faculty in Asian American studies. So that's a story in itself. And a minor is, you know, it doesn't have the ability within the academic senate politics to actually hire its own faculty. You know, only if you have a department does that have enough. A department sits as on its own and is able to get new faculty from the administration. So even though the minor was approved, it wasn't enough to have total autonomy, but it was a huge leap. I mean, you know, a year after teaching this course already, you know, the minor was approved. So.
Simeon, do you want to share how different that process might have been for you?
Yeah, it's very different. So for me, I think the proposal wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for the student organizers of the Coalition for Critical Asian American Studies, or CCAS. So when I came into UCSD 2016, I was introduced to CCAS. Year in, year out, I went to their mixers and they would give a presentation about the need for Asian American studies. So I really just want to like acknowledge that, right? Like it was the students who kept that push and kept that momentum over the past few years to develop an Asian American studies program. I think when the faculty got together to talk about it, some of the challenges or questions that we started asking were, okay, like what does it mean to create a minor program, right? Are students actually going to declare the minor, right? Are there going to be enough faculty teaching courses and willing to like rotate to serve the director position? Where was it going to be housed, right? So all of these questions that ultimately, I think like in the last few years was when things started lining up. You know, like a number of us got hired around the same time, right? There's like a new infusion of Asian American Studies faculty. The Institute of Arts and Humanities also was proposed as a place that could house the minor. So yeah, I think like the momentum really started to build in the past couple of years, and the support that I got in writing this proposal. I'm just gonna like name some names here. Like Wendy, you were really instrumental in the drafting of the proposal. Professor Yanis Spiritu was also really instrumental in supporting this. Professor Nancy Kwok, director of the Institute of Arts and Humanities, was also really crucial. Catherine Levy, the MSO of the Institute, also did a lot of the behind the scenes labor, and Dean Della Coletta, right? So like without all of this support from students, faculty, staff, and administrators, this wouldn't have happened. So I do want to say too, like now that the program is established, like the support continues, right? Like, and this is also something that maybe is not as visible, right? Like we know the program exists, but like the people who have really like infused like energy into the program and like kept it going. Like I also just want to shout out like Jen Schwarzkopf, who is the coordinator for the program, Christella Garcia Spitz and Alana Aiko Moore, and Heather Smedberg, like the three librarians who have been really crucial in supporting Daphne and Victoria and the whole AAPI archive project. Right, so I just want to uplift them. And lastly, I also want to say like APSA and APIA, so Asian and Pacific Islanders for Arts and Humanities and Asian and Pacific Islander Student Alliance, right? Like, and also APIMETA programs and services. Like all of these organizations have been really helpful in promoting the minor this past year. So.
So Simeon, you mentioned a little bit about the archive project. We've kind of talked about it, you know, and some of the work that Daphne has been working on and things like that too. Can you talk a little bit about that? Can you share why you thought it was important that the API Studies Community Archive Project was started, and how you think the information that's being archived will be helpful to the campus and to folks that might want to interact with this type of program?
Yeah, so the archive project, the objective is to document the history of activism revolving around the creation of the Asian American Studies program, but also generally AAPI student activism at UCSD, right? And we are documenting that through conducting and collecting oral histories, and also building a timeline of kind of events that happened in the past. So again, this project wouldn't have happened if Daphne and Victoria didn't first approach us in the fall and kind of like showcase all of the abundance of research that you all put into doing this documentation work, like doing research in special collections. So it really started from that, and now we have a really amazing group of undergrad, grad students who are invested in this project, conducting oral histories with alumni, with Professor Lin. So I think it's important, right? Because like Jim said, when programs get established, it's easy to kind of like forget that there are really long struggles to get there, right? Programs don't just magically appear. They don't just get created because administrators say we need this, right? So I think the first objective of this project really is to shed light on that hidden history of activism. And also think it's important for students now who are engaging in campus activism to see that their struggles that they are taking part in is part of this longer struggle on campus, right? I think being able to like listen to some of these oral histories with alumni, like it can be very inspiring, I think, to see that, you know, they're not imagining and like trying to build something from scratch, but that they're part of this lineage. And I guess like the big hope for me through this project is that we might be able to facilitate a shift in how we think about our relationship to the institution, right? Because often I think it's easy for us to think, you know, the university already has a set curriculum, everything is predetermined, students can come in, take classes, declare a major, get that paper and leave, right? But I think listening to these oral histories and like researching these past struggles, like hopefully we can like be more aware of how the university itself is a site of struggle, right? And that students do have the power to change the institution, to push for it to be more, yeah, to be better. So yeah, I just want to say that.
Jim, you've come and spoken with the students twice now this year, and I've gotten a little bit of a sense of what the group is, where the group has started and what they are learning. What is something that you hope that, you know, students who are participating, who, you know, maybe are filling out the form to start participating or show interest in participating in the future, what do you hope that they learn through their participation in this type of project?
Yeah, you know, basically, I had to admit to myself that I'm an elder now. You know, I kind of pretended, you know, because I feel a tremendous affinity with the young students who are here. You know, I'm still kind of in that group where I'm constantly learning. There's all kinds of things I don't know. I still want to attend Asian American Studies lectures. I still want to go to the cross-cultural center and attend all those things. And just to give a perspective, I hope they have a perspective that, you know, sort of the all around the country, right, this recent outbreak of anti-Asian hate that has caused all these university presidents to denounce the Asian racism. And then all these students around the country are demanding the creation of Asian American studies, because the discrimination against Asians is an Asian American studies issue. It's not an Asian studies issue. And so I'd like them to see that, you know, how you institutionalize something like this is much more complicated. You have to build coalitions with the community, you have to have faculty helping out with this so that you can't, because students are going to leave in 4 years, they're going to graduate in 4 years, that's just going to happen. And so you have to kind of cultivate a long-term view. And I think of the students who took my course, you know, 35 years ago, they're in their mid-50s, and they really fought for Asian American studies, and they never saw it institutionalized, you know. So you fight for things that, you believe in, even though in your lifetime they may never happen, you know. And I think that there's, you know, if you look at the history of social justice, there's so many leaders who fought for things they believed in and then they passed away, you know. And most of these people that I talked about today, they're gone, you know. Beverly Yip is gone. Many of the people on the Committee on Educational Policy is gone. Vice Chancellor Harold Tico is gone. So you may never, most of these people may never live to see what they believe in. But the fact that, you know, Tommy and I believed in it so strongly, and Wing Chi did, and Beverly did, as a result, students now get to reap the benefits. On other campuses, they have to start from the beginning. And I know so many stories of Asian students on, you know, places like Dartmouth or even Harvard and stuff that are protesting the creation of Asian American studies, but they don't have a faculty person to partner with. They don't have community people. The fact that the International School Pacific Rim relations just happened to be created at the time when I was teaching Asian American studies showed that economically that Asian Americans would play a huge role. So there's all the, you know, to say that it's just started by student activism is just not, it's just so much more complicated than that. So I want them to understand that too. And then literally you guys are the leaders. You know, you who are doing the archive project, you may think, oh, you're kind of a small dot in the grand scheme of things, but these small dots amount to this incredible, powerful force. You know, Wendy. I mean, without Wendy, I would have probably never met Simeon. You know, because you know I was both kind of shy and stuff, and so you need a whole bunch of different skills. You know, actually in life, you need the skill of being able to organize people. You need the skill of being able to inspire people. And you need to be able to work across all different areas of expertise to communicate well. So, you know, until you have all those skills, then you won't be able to move. You know, a lot of things fall short because social justice movements lack some of those skills. So.
You know, I think listening to you talk to him, it reminded me of one of the last kinds of gatherings. You know, Simeon had mentioned CCAS would hold some gatherings about every year and a half after the open letter was published in 2014. And the last one we held was kind of coordinated with CCAS and Simeon and Nancy Kwok, and you'd come to that one as well as other faculty came, and it was probably the most serious of the conversations I think we had around this is a potential, it could be proposed. It's, you know, there's support from a dean. And I remember looking across at you and seeing your jaw drop and being so surprised. You're like, there's support from a dean? This could happen? And you said out loud, I didn't know that I was going to be around for when there would be this kind of support. And so I've always kind of remembered that somewhere. As those things happen, because, you know, like in hearing you talk about this even more recently than this about, you know, who's still around from then and what people got to see, but how much this was still important to people. Yeah, I think about that and your reaction specifically, because you were sitting right in my line of sight when that got said. That, yeah, I think about that too. And I was thinking about that as you were speaking. Right just then. So, you know, over the last couple of months, Simeon, when we've been with the students with the archive project, we have gotten to hear from a lot of the alumni. We reviewed a number of different kinds of documents, heard, you know, from Jim, what kinds of things did, can you name one thing that has been really surprising? I think there's been a lot of different kinds of conversations we've had where we have all been a little bit surprised by what we have learned in uncovering some of these documents. But could you share one thing in particular that stuck with you that has been surprising that we've learned, or that you've learned through this project?
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised to learn that the minor was approved in the late 80s, but that did not go anywhere, in part because of the university's inability to recruit some of these like really amazing faculty, like Evelyn Nakano-Glenn, Su Cheng Chan. And I think when I was reading the documents, I was really surprised to see the like resignation letters from Jim, right? And from other people serving on the search committee, just out of sheer frustration with the fact that all of your efforts have, over the past several years, was met with such like disrespect from department chairs, right? And also the administration. So yeah, that really struck out to me. And yeah, I can't imagine the frustration that you all felt going through that process.
So I know as we've been kind of talking about this, and sometimes in the classes, and the students are starting to collect oral histories, or some of them have done that and are in the process of transcribing this. We've had some conversations about how this information is going to be kept. Can you share a little bit about what you hope will happen with the information, Simeon, and what you think the direction of the project will be?
So I think the plan, I mean, everything is being worked out as we speak, right? I think the plan is to create a website. We will have the oral histories and some of these archival documents shareable publicly on this website. Yeah, and my hope is that we'll continue to grow the oral history collections and kind of see where this project might go in future years. But if folks are interested in kind of learning more and possibly being a part of this project next year, I think there was so Daphne shared a link, a Google form. Just fill out your email and we'll be in touch about it.
I had shared a post on Facebook earlier, and tagged both of you in it actually, of this picture that I found that I had posted 7 years ago today of two UCSD alums who had come back and were invited to speak on their research on Filipino American students, so Dina Maramba and Rick Bonus, and this was part of CCAS's push to show that there were faculty that could be hired at UCSD that were studying Asian American people and teaching and doing research and things like that. And so that was funny that it had come up as a memory today, because we were going to have this conversation, and in part of that, I wrote that in a couple of weeks we're going to have our first group of students who have declared the Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies minor, and will graduate with that minor. So, I think this is an excellent start for the program. But I think I'd like for you each to share a little bit about, what kinds of things do you think are important about this now that, there will soon be graduates leaving UCSD with this minor, and what you hope for the future of the minor will be. I don't have a preference of who starts. I don't know if one of you is more ready to try and answer that first.
Yeah, I can say a little bit. So I think it's super important to have this program right now at this moment, for several reasons. One, as I mentioned earlier, like there's still a need and desire for students to see like their histories, curriculum, literatures, cultures reflected in the classes that they're taking, right? So I think that is something that I think the program can help facilitate. Um, I also think given this current moment of reinvigorated white supremacy, anti-Asian violence, I think we need, like, it's like more urgent than ever for us to develop a critical analysis of what's going on, right? Like, how do we talk about what we're seeing, as not just like individual acts of like bigotry and prejudice, but as being connected to these other systems of violence, violence of policing, violence of settler colonialism, the struggles in Palestine and elsewhere, right? All of these things are deeply connected. And so my hope is that the program can be a space where we can like cultivate a critical vocabulary for understanding this mess that we're currently living in. Um, and as for like future directions of the program, like I would like to continue to develop relationships with San Diego communities, to, you know, uplift and support the work that they're doing, and also to hire more Pacific Islander studies faculty. So AAPI, like we know that it's a problematic framing, in the sense that like Asian American often like dominates the Pacific, like Pacific Islanders are rendered invisible within this like framing, right? So my hope is that at the very least, like this coupling, the way that we're framing this program for now, like can allow us to push for greater representation of PI studies in the curriculum, and also like more faculty hires.
And Simeon, I do want to add that that was some part of the activism from students, right? When right as this iteration of the minor was being proposed, that from the current group of CCAS membership, that was an ask that they asked and included, was the inclusion of Pacific Islander in the naming of the minor, but also with the commitment that there would be more that could be done to support Pacific Islander faculty and coursework, and different kinds of ways that could be brought to be more visible. And to my knowledge, currently there's one Pacific Islander identified faculty member at UC San Diego. So I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to share with that, but as you were bringing it up, I was like, oh, that should probably be mentioned as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, since we've covered a lot, I'd like to speculate a little bit about where Asian American studies could go, because there's a lot of, and this is pure speculation, I may be totally wrong, but I'm a gambler and I'm willing to put some things out. And I would, looking at this whole history of bias and racism, and it's a repeatable playbook that, when I look at the anti-Asian hate now, I'm not surprised, because all the things I've learned about Asian American studies say that this is a formula. And I think that now I've started to talk to some scientists about this, because actually my older daughter's boyfriend is a neuroscientist. And I think that, because there are a lot of Asian scientists on campus, especially in neuroscience, I think that there's new research coming out about how hard it is to change people's minds. about some political issue. Like I've been reading Daniel Kahneman. He's a Nobel Prize winner in behavioral economics. And he did all this study about how it's very difficult to change people's minds once they come to a conclusion, like, fake news, the election is a fraud. I mean, why are people still supporting that when all the data says otherwise? And he explains to me that basically, partly the brain is set up that it's very difficult to change people's minds. To change them, you have to have infusion of dopamine to the brain before someone can possibly change their minds. On the other hand, if you're between the ages of 15 and 23, sort of college age, then you're much more resilient and flexible about looking at things and making decisions for yourself. So I think that, all these things, climate change, implicit bias, all these things are actually have a neuroscientific origin, and it's much more difficult, no matter how racist you explain people are, they don't change their mind nearly as easily. So how can we incorporate that into all the studies that are going on around racial issues and other things? So I see that as a possible future thing, especially UCSD has a very large neuroscience group. So again, it's pure speculation. It may not amount to anything, but Daniel Kahneman, he's a Nobel Prize winner, and he did extensive studies that, really, that to me is some explanation of why this racism is so deep rooted.
Yeah, I guess relatively related too, even in 2014 when CCAS was talking about things that they wanted to see with the potential of having an Asian American Studies minor, it was connected to, what does this mean for Asian American people in science, right? Like in some of them were also STEM majors, right? But what did it mean in health fields? What did it mean in psychology? How are there different kinds of courses? As many of the courses at the time were in history and literature. There are a couple of classes, I think, in music and anthropology and a couple of other places, right? But that they weren't seeing some of the coursework in public health or things that might lead to medicine and things like that too. So there's certainly some different places that can mean that the curriculum could grow, and perhaps there's more, there's more academic interest, right, to create the kinds of things that people could use as readings and things that they could teach in that type of course.
Right. I mean, they now know that, and this is fairly recent, right? They study trauma, and they say that the brain has a fight or flight response, And if you look at Asian American history, right, there's a long history. The Chinese filed maybe 7,000 lawsuits about, racist things that were done to them. And they were lynched along the West Coast, and there was an ethnic cleansing along the West Coast. And only now, like Antioch, which is a city in the Bay Area, they're talking about apologizing to what they did to the Chinese. But so there's a long history of Asians fighting this racism, as good as they could. And they'd get defeated all the time, so much so that they chose the flight response, like, I'm going to avoid being visible. I'm going to follow the model minority myth of, I'm going to be hardworking and quiet and not speak up about this, because to fight against it is impossible. But now, huge change between 1980s and now, there's all these lawyers, there's legislators, there's a huge number, the head of Common Cause is Asian, the head of the Southern Poverty Law Conference is Asian, the head of elder care for supporting domestic workers taking care of older people is Asian, and a MacArthur Genius Award. Asians have won the Pulitzer Prize in Literature. So when you have this tremendous increase in infrastructure, then that's the huge difference. I mean, they can fight now. They don't necessarily have to, flee. And so that's how hopeful I am about, what are the new battles that are going to occur? The fact that Biden passed an anti-Asian hate bill, those are because of the infrastructure that exists now that wasn't there before.
Right, and the vice president is also Asian American, so I'm sure that's helpful as well.
And we have a chancellor that's Asian.
Mm-hmm.
So, he doesn't probably think this way, but it matters. So, yeah. So I think Asian American psychology will be quite a future thing that will be studied.
Yeah, and there are courses in some other places. My previous campus of employment was Cornell University, and the person who started the Asian American Studies program at Cornell was a psychologist, and so did teach a couple of classes, but one of them very specifically on Asian American college student psychology. So even when she was teaching that quite a while ago, I think that she was able to teach something then, and now there's multiple books that Asian American psychologists have published talking about different kinds of things related to Asian American psychology. So yeah, there's certainly potential in that field as well.
Yeah, Daryl Sue, of course.
Yes.
Key book on microaggressions. So anyway, there's room for a new area of research in that.
So those are, I think, all of the questions that I had prepared, and I didn't know if there's anything else that either one of you were hoping to be able to share with the audience today before we end this conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having, for 35 years, I thought this was something I did in my past life, and essentially forgot about it. And then all of a sudden, with this uncovering of all these documents and all this interest in Asian American studies, somehow people want to know what I did. So that's the feeling I have. And that basically people knew what I did probably up until about 2000. And then after 2000, there was a whole new administration, Becky Pettit got hired, CCAS, and all the people who used to know what I did actually have passed away. So, and I didn't know it. I was still acting like I'm still a young person, and I'm not, and Wendy, you mentioned that, the Native American elders, pass on the wisdom so that this can sustain itself. And then after I admitted to myself I'm an elder, that kind of hit me hard that, yeah, I have a story to tell that most people don't know. So it's a weird feeling, but it is what it is. And Daphne, you've been such an inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just want to echo and say thank you to Jim. Thank you for sharing the space, sharing your knowledge and your experiences with us. Yeah, and thank you, Daphne, Wendy, Happy Meta staff for putting this event together and for to all of you for being here.
All right. Thank you both. I'm honored to be able to work with both of you and to be here to have this conversation with you both today. For everyone else, thank you for coming. I appreciate your willingness to continue to learn about this, and I hope that particularly those of you who are students are interested in participating in the API Studies Community Archive Project as we hope to continue to collect stories. There's a lot more people that we didn't get to talk with yet, and we're hoping to continue to have some of these conversations and continue conversations with some of the people that we have been able to speak with. So thank you all for coming today.